because revivals happened so frequently there that it was like a wildfire had gone through and there was nothing left to burn. And so many revival meetings were held in those places that their inhabitants eventually grew indifferent to the gospel and to view it as shallow or ingenuine. And so it was the opposite effect of what you would hope a revival would bring. They became callous towards revival. And then there was a focus on innovating new methods of bringing revival manually. You can can it and spread it on a mass scale to be used anywhere, mass produce it. So some of these methods were called the new measures, which focused on encouraging people to revive themselves rather than letting revival happen organically. Perhaps two familiar methods that we see even today are the altar call and what was called the anxious bench. Now, there's nothing wrong with those things in and of themselves. They can be used with God very greatly. So the altar call, we even see that a lot of that in our churches today. At the end of the service, you have emotional music playing. People are invited to come to the front and turn their lives over to Christ. And then the anxious bench, sort of along the same lines, was a bench right up at the front where people who who were anxious about their salvation or wanted to be prayed over could come up and be close to the preacher and be prayed over. So again, nothing wrong with those of themselves, but those things can also be abused to induce people into false conversions in the spur of the moment and the heat of emotion rather than from lasting substance. And two of today's major cults also began in the third phase of the Great Awakening, with their leaders taking advantage of the spiritual sensationalism of the era to draw people into their own personal religions that departed from orthodoxy. So William Miller, does anyone know who William Miller was? He led a movement called the Millerites, who eventually turned into Seventh-day Adventists. And so he predicted that Christ would return in 1843. And so he had to be ready. There was a great amount of fervor about getting ready for the end. And then when that return didn't happen, they were, of course, disappointed and revisited their ideas and came to the conclusion that Christ came spiritually but not physically. And so then you have the Adventists coming out of that movement. And William Miller was actually a Baptist before the Seventh-day Adventists came around. So there's William Miller, and then does anyone have a guess as to the other big name that started a cult in this time? Joseph Smith, yes. So Joseph Smith founded the Mormon Church, and he claimed to have received new revelation from the angel Moroni when he published the Book of Mormon in 1830. So I just mentioned some of the bad things that came out of the Second Great Awakening. What about the good things? The Second Great Awakening did spur the American church to become more socially active and involved in society, not just in spiritual matters, but also meeting the physical needs of the community around them, to minister to people physically and practically. We saw the advent of Sunday school, for example, as a means of educating the poor in the local communities, not just about the Bible, which of course is important, you need to have that, but also about general skills that would improve their quality of life, such as literacy, job skills, and cleanliness. And then we also saw the advent of tract and Bible societies. such as the American Bible Society that was formed to deliver the Bible and Christian literature to people across the country, and other societies to spread Christian literature across the world. And then the Second Great Awakening was also responsible for a large growth in the abolitionist movement. And Christians in both the North and the South sought more fervently to end slavery. Of course, that eventually came to a head in the Civil War. So, lessons from the Second Great Awakening. Revival can be good if it's genuine, and bad if it's not. So as we go into our revival meetings in this next week, be attuned to the working of the Holy Spirit and let God be your guide. Don't try to force things, but also, well, as Pastor mentioned in his sermon 2 weeks ago, I think, the metaphor of being the pen dipped in ink ready to write on people's hearts. You aren't the one doing the writing, but if you aren't dipped in ink, then you won't be ready to write when God wants to use you. So be dipped in ink and be ready.
I think that would be like you ever heard of Brother Sheffy?
Yes.
That would be his time period, correct?
He would have been on the latter end of that.
Yeah. Very interesting. I did not realize that it lasted that long. And how many were shocked that it was 10% of Americans going to church? I thought maybe 50, but I never would have guessed 10. But all you have to do is really look at the churches around America, and most of them start, if you look at their cornerstone, if it's an old church, late in the 1800s, if it's really old church. There's very few churches, especially in this area, and just a little bit east of here, not quite to the East Coast, that started before 18-something. So that's great. And then I never realized the Methodists were with the Baptists on settling spiritually the Western frontier. But you see a lot of Methodist churches around. The church that we came out of, New Concord, the big church there right now, or that was prominent, was the Methodist Church. So that makes sense. All right. Very interesting. It's good to know these things because if you don't know your past, you're doomed to repeat it. And we don't want to do that. All right. So we have, everybody have their prayer sheet? Do you have one? You need one? They're in the back.